In a quiet Brookhaven home, Rusty's eerie growls unearth a chilling attic mystery, sparking a thrilling journey. Welcome to Pause Verve. Like and share this video with those who needs love. The morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of the living room in the small Virginia town of Brookhaven, casting a soft golden glow across the hardwood floors, where Rusty, the family's golden retriever, usually sprawled for his mid-morning nap, his fluffy tail thumping lazily against the rug. Today was different, sharper somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. David, a practical father with a knack for fixing anything mechanical from toasters to tractor engines, stood frozen in the doorway, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, steam curling upward unnoticed as he watched Rusty. The dog wasn't lounging or chasing his tail, like he typically did, his boundless energy a constant source of laughter for the family, often prompting David to joke that Rusty could power the whole town if they hooked him to a treadmill. Instead, Rusty was planted like a statue in front of the attic door, his golden fur bristling along his spine, his nose twitching as he stared at the chipped white paint of the doorframe, where years of humidity had left faint cracks spiderwebbing the surface. A low growl rumbled from his chest, not the playful woof he used to greet the mailman or the excited yip when David tossed a frisbee in the backyard, but something deeper, almost urgent, vibrating through the quiet house like a warning, bell echoing in the stillness. David had never seen him like this, not in the 6 years since they'd brought Rusty home as a gangly pup who'd tripped over his own paws and chewed through Ellen's favorite throw pillow. Rusty was the kind of dog who'd offer a slobbery tennis ball to a stranger, who'd flop onto his back for belly rubs from anyone willing to oblige, even the grumpy neighbor Mr. Callahan, who'd softened over time thanks to Rusty's relentless charm. But now his ears were forward pinned tight, his tail stiff as a board, one paw lifted slightly off the ground, as if ready to spring, his warm brown eyes locked on the door with an intensity that made David's skin prickle. The air felt heavier, somehow charged with an unspoken tension that seemed to pulse in time with Rusty's growls. David set his mug down on the side table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood, his brow furrowing as he stepped closer, his work boots scuffing the floor. Rusty didn't acknowledge him, didn't even flick an ear, his focus unyielding, as if the door held secrets only he could sense. A faint scratching sound came from the attic above, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant chirp of sparrows outside, where spring was just beginning to coax buds from the dogwood trees. David tilted his head, thinking it might be a squirrel or maybe a bird that had slipped through a loose shingle after last night's rain, which had left the town smelling of wet earth and pine. Brookhaven's old houses, built in the early 1900s, were no strangers to critters, their creaky beams and drafty corners practically inviting guests of the furry variety. David had patched a hole in the roof just last summer, after a raccoon family made itself at home, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints and chewed insulation. Still, Rusty's posture kept David rooted in place, a prickle of unease crawling up his neck like a cold breeze slipping through an open window. The dog's growl shifted sharper now, almost a whine, as if he were trying to communicate something David couldn't grasp, a message carried in the tilt of his head, the tension in his shoulders. The living room, with its worn plaid couch where Lily sprawled to study, its cluttered bookshelf, stuffed with Ellen's cookbooks and David's dog-eared repair manuals, and the framed family photos capturing summers at the lake, felt suddenly too small, too ordinary for whatever was unfolding. David's instinct was to call for his wife Ellen, who was probably wrist-deep in bread dough in the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour as she hummed old folk tunes, but he hesitated, not wanting to alarm her if it was nothing, just another critter they'd laugh about over dinner. Yet Rusty's unwavering stare made nothing feel impossible, dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. The scratching came again, louder this time, followed by a soft thump like something heavy shifting behind the door, maybe a box tipping over, or something else, something that made David's pulse quicken. Rusty took a step forward, his nose nearly touching the doorknob, his body taut as a bowstring, his growl deepening into a sound that seemed to vibrate in David's chest. The attic wasn't a place they went often, just a dusty space crammed with Christmas decorations, old furniture, and boxes of Lily's childhood artwork. But now it felt like a stranger's territory, holding something Rusty deemed urgent. David's practical side, the part that fixed problems with a wrench and a plan, wrestled with the growing sense that this wasn't a simple fix, that Rusty's instincts were picking up on something beyond a trapped animal. He crouched beside the dog, his hand hovering over Rusty's back, not touching, not wanting to break the dog's focus. Rusty's eyes flicked to David for the first time, a silent plea in their warm brown depths, urging him to act, to listen, to trust. Another thump came, softer now, but deliberate, like a footstep or a hand brushing against wood. And David's heart gave a quick thud, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them as simple as a squirrel. The house seemed to hold its breath, the usual creaks and groans silenced, as if waiting for what came next. Rusty's tail twitched once, then stilled his body, leaning forward, as if he could will the door open himself. David stood, his hand on the doorknob, now cool under his palm, his other hand resting lightly on Rusty's head, feeling the dog's warmth, the steady pulse of his determination. Whatever was up there, Rusty knew it wasn't just a stray creature, knew it in a way that made David's practical world tilt just a little. This moment, he realized, was the start of something bigger, something that would pull his family into a mystery. They couldn't ignore a story that began not with a plan or a choice, but with a dog who sensed what no one else could. Rusty's growl softened, but his eyes never left the door, his body a quiet promise that whatever lay beyond, he was ready, and David would have to be too. The attic door loomed before David, his hand still gripping the knob. Rusty's low growl, a steady hum at his side, as the morning light filtered through the Brookhaven house, casting long shadows across the living room floor. The faint scratching from above had stopped, but the silence felt heavier now, like the calm before a storm. David's practical mind churned, weighing whether to open the door or call for backup, his instinct to protect his family warring with the need to understand. What had Rusty so on edge? Before he could decide, a soft clatter came from the kitchen, followed by the warm scent of rising bread and Ellen's familiar hum drifting through the air. Ellen, his wife of 22 years, was likely shaping dough for her famous cinnamon rolls, the kind that drew neighbors to their porch on weekends. Her apron dusted with flour as she moved with the easy rhythm of someone who found joy in feeding others. David turned his head about to call her, when Rusty's growl spiked sharp and insistent, his eyes flicking to David with a look that said, "Now." The urgency in the dog's stare pushed David to act, but he wasn't alone in this house, and whatever was up there deserved a family decision. "Ellen," he called, his voice steady, but low, not wanting to startle her. The humming stopped and Ellen appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark hair tied back in a loose bun, a streak of flour on her cheek, her hazel eyes narrowing as she took in David's tense posture and Rusty's rigid form. "What's going on?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron, her gaze darting to the attic door where Rusty's nose was now pressed against the wood. "Something's in the attic," David said, keeping his voice calm, though his heart was still thudding from the last thump he'd heard. "Rusty's acting like it's not just a squirrel." Ellen stepped closer, her brows knitting together as she watched. Rusty, whose tail hadn't wagged once, a stark contrast to his usual exuberance. "That's new," she said, crouching beside the dog, her hand hovering near his fur, not touching, as if sensing his focus. "Could be a raccoon nesting," she offered, but her tone lacked conviction, her eyes meeting David's with a flicker of unease. The attic wasn't a place they visited often, its steep stairs and low ceiling making it more trouble than it was worth. But Ellen's practical streak matched David's, and she wasn't one to jump to wild conclusions. Still, Rusty's behavior was a puzzle, one that made her linger rather than return to her dough. Before they could debate further, a creak came from the staircase, and Lily, their 19-year-old daughter, shuffled into view, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her oversized college hoodie slipping off one shoulder, her dark curls a tangled halo around her face. "What's with Rusty?" she asked, yawning, her voice thick with the grogginess of a late-night study session. She froze mid-step as she noticed the scene: her father by the attic door, her mother kneeling beside a growling Rusty, the air thick with tension. David pointed to the door, keeping his voice low. "Something's up there, and Rusty's not letting it go." Lily's eyes widened, her curiosity waking her up faster than coffee ever could. She stepped closer, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the hardwood, her gaze darting between Rusty and the door. "That's creepy," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if whatever was above might hear. "Is it like a person or something?" Ellen shot her a look, shaking her head. Why would a person be in our attic, Lily? But the question hung there unanswered, because Rusty's growl deepened, his body shifting forward, as another soft thump echoed from above, this one slower, almost deliberate. David's hand tightened on the knob, his practical side faltering under the weight of Rusty's insistence. The family stood in a loose triangle, David at the door, Ellen and Rusty near the center, Lily a step behind, her arms crossed, but her eyes bright with a mix of fear and fascination. They were close-knit, the kind of family who shared meals and stories, who weathered life's ups and downs with laughter and trust. But this moment felt different, like a page turning to a chapter they hadn't read before. Ellen stood brushing her hands on her apron, her practical nature kicking in. "Let's not overthink it," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Maybe we open the door just a crack, see if it scurries out." David nodded, but Rusty's sudden bark, sharp and commanding, made them all jump. His eyes locked on the door, as if daring it to stay closed. Lily took a step back, her hand clutching the sleeve of her hoodie, but her curiosity held her in place. "What if it's not an animal?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her imagination already spinning tales of ghosts or intruders. David met Ellen's eyes, seeing the same question mirrored there, the same trust in Rusty that kept them from dismissing this as nothing. They'd always relied on each other. David's steady hands, Ellen's warm heart, Lily's sharp mind, but now Rusty was the one leading the charge, his instincts a compass they couldn't ignore. David's fingers twitched on the knob, his heart pounding, not just from the unknown, but from the realization that this was a family moment, a test of their bond, their willingness to face something together. Rusty's growl softened, but his body stayed taut, his eyes flicking to each of them, as if to say, "Trust me." Ellen nodded at David, her hand resting lightly on Rusty's back, now a silent agreement that they'd follow the dog's lead. Lily edged closer, her fear giving way to the pull of the mystery, her hand brushing against her mother's arm. The attic door stood before them, its chipped paint and tarnished knob suddenly more than just a barrier, a gateway to something that Rusty alone seemed to understand. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his family's trust, the warmth of their presence, and the unwavering certainty of the dog at their side. The attic door creaked as David eased it open, just a sliver, the stale scent of dust and old wood wafting into the living room, where the Brookhaven morning light seemed to dim as if holding its breath. Rusty's growl sharpened, his golden fur bristling as he pressed closer to the gap, his nose twitching with fierce focus, his body a taut coil of instinct. David's heart pounded, his practical mind grappling with the unknown, as Ellen stood close, her hand still on Rusty's back, her hazel eyes wide with a mix of caution and trust. Lily hovered behind her college hoodie, bunched in her fists, her curiosity outweighing her fear, as she peered over her mother's shoulder, her breath catching at the faint rustle from above. The scratching had stopped, but the thumps lingered in, their minds each one heavier than the last, not the skitter of a squirrel, but something deliberate, something alive. David pushed the door wider, the hinges groaning in protest, revealing the narrow attic stairs, their edges worn from decades of forgotten footsteps, the darkness above swallowing the light like a curtain drawn tight. Rusty surged forward, but David caught his collar, gently holding him back. "Not yet, boy," he whispered, though his voice trembled with the effort to stay calm. Ellen's hand tightened on Rusty's fur, her practical streak faltering, as the rustle came again, louder now, like fabric dragging across floorboards, followed by a soft, muffled groan that froze them all in place. "That's not an animal," Lily breathed, her voice a mix of awe and dread. Her eyes locked on the stairwell where shadows seemed to shift. David's grip on the knob tightened, his mind racing through possibilities, a trapped neighbor, an injured worker, but none fit Rusty's relentless focus. The dog's eyes burning with a certainty that made David's skin prickle. Ellen nodded at him, her face pale but resolute. "Go slow," she mouthed, and David took a step onto the stairs, the wood creaking under his weight, Rusty straining against his hold, eager to lead. The air grew thicker as they climbed, the musty smell mingling with something sharper, almost metallic, the darkness giving way to faint outlines of boxes and old furniture stacked haphazardly under the slanted roof. Lily followed close, her sneakers soft on the steps, her breath quick and shallow, while Ellen stayed at the base, her hand on the railing, ready to call for help if needed. At the top, David paused, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, a single bulb dangling from a frayed cord, casting weak light across the cluttered space. Rusty's growl turned to a whine, his nose pointing to a corner where a pile of old blankets and crates formed a makeshift wall. The groan came again, clearer now, human, unmistakable, and David's heart lurched as he released Rusty, who bounded forward, weaving through the clutter with purpose. David followed his flashlight beam, cutting through the dust, revealing a shape beneath. The blanket's not a pile of fabric, but a person curled tight, their body trembling under the weight of grime and time. Helen's gasp echoed from below as David knelt, pushing the blankets aside, to reveal a woman, her face lined with age. Her hair matted and grey, her skin smudged with dust and soot, her eyes fluttering open in confusion. She was frail, maybe in her 70s, her clothes tattered, a faded sweater, and worn slacks clinging to her thin frame. Rusty nudged her hand gently, his whine softening to a low hum, his tail giving a single slow wag, as if to say, "I found you." The woman's lips moved, muttering something incoherent about the dog, knowing her voice raspy, like she hadn't spoken in days. David's practical side kicked in his hands, steady, as he checked for injuries, finding none, but noting her clammy skin, her shallow breaths. Ellen was at his side now, her baker's hands gentle as she touched the woman's shoulder. "We've got you," she murmured, her voice warm like the bread she baked, a lifeline in the dusty attic. Lily stood, frozen, her eyes wide as she clutched her. "Hoodie, this is insane," she whispered, but she didn't retreat, her curiosity tethering her to the moment. The woman's eyes focused briefly, locking onto Rusty, who sat close, his warm brown gaze steady and calm. "Good dog," she rasped, her voice barely audible but heavy with gratitude, before her eyes closed again, her body slumping with exhaustion. David lifted her carefully, her weight light as a child's, his arms steady despite the shock coursing through him. Ellen cleared a path, moving boxes with quick efficiency, while Lily ran ahead to grab blankets and call for help, her voice shaking, but clear as she dialed 911. Rusty stayed at David's heels, his presence a quiet anchor. As they descended the stairs, the woman cradled against David's chest, her breathing uneven but alive. In the living room, they laid her on the couch, Ellen wrapping her in a quilt, the soft patchwork a stark contrast to the attic's grim dust. Rusty curled up beside the couch, his nose resting near the woman's hand, his eyes never leaving her face, as if guarding a treasure he'd fought to uncover. The family stood together, their shock giving way to a shared resolve, their home no longer just a house, but a stage for something extraordinary. David met Ellen's eyes, seeing his own questions mirrored there. Who was she? How did she get here? Why did Rusty know? Lily knelt beside Rusty, her hand on his fur, her voice soft. He knew, didn't he? He knew she was there. The distant wail of sirens broke the silence, but the moment held them, the family, the dog, the stranger, bound by a mystery that Rusty had sensed when no one else could, a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. The living room of the Brookhaven house buzzed with a quiet urgency as the wail of sirens grew closer, the morning light now sharp through the lace curtains, casting jagged shadows across the quilt draped over the frail woman on the couch. David stood by her side, his practical hands still tingling from carrying her down the attic stairs, his eyes scanning her pale face for signs of distress, her shallow breaths, a reminder of how fragile this moment was. Ellen knelt beside the couch, her baker's fingers gently adjusting the quilt, tucking it around the woman's thin shoulders, her warmth a steady anchor in the chaos as she murmured soft reassurances. "You're safe now. We've got you." Rusty lay curled at the base of the couch, his golden fur pressed against the fabric, his nose inches from the woman's dangling hand, his warm brown eyes fixed on her with a devotion that seemed to hold the room together. Lily hovered near the window, her college hoodie twisted in her hands, her phone still clutched from calling 911, her voice trembling as she whispered to herself, "This is real, this is actually happening." The woman stirred her eyelids, fluttering her raspy voice, breaking the silence with a faint "good dog," directed at Rusty, who responded with a soft whine, his tail giving a single slow wag, as if acknowledging her gratitude. David's heart thudded, not just from the shock of finding her, but from the weight of Rusty's role, the dog's instincts having led them to a person, not a pest, a life teetering on the edge. Ellen met David's eyes, her practical streak kicking in. "We need water," she said, standing swiftly, her apron still dusted with flour as she moved to the kitchen, her steps quick but steady. David nodded, checking the woman's pulse again, his fingers finding a weak but steady rhythm, his mind racing with questions. How long had she been up there? How had she survived? Why had no one noticed? The woman's clothes were tattered, a faded sweater and slacks caked with dust, her skin clammy under the grime, suggesting days, maybe weeks of neglect. Rusty nudged her hand again, his nose gentle but insistent, and she stirred once more, her eyes opening briefly to lock onto the dog, a faint smile curving her lips, before she slipped back into stillness. Lily turned from the window, her eyes wide. "Dad, should we move her or something?" she asked, her voice a mix of fear and eagerness to help. David shook his head. "Not yet. Let's wait for the paramedics," he said, his voice calm, though his thoughts were anything but. The sirens were loud now, tires crunching on the gravel drive as red and blue lights flashed through the curtains. Ellen returned with a glass of water and a damp cloth, her hands steady as she wiped the woman's forehead, the simple act grounding them all in the face of the unknown. The front door burst open, and two paramedics rushed in, their bags clanking as they knelt beside the couch, their voices clipped but professional. "What's her condition?" they asked. David stepped back, giving them space. "She's breathing, but weak," he said. "Found her in the attic. No idea how long she's been there." The paramedics worked quickly, checking vitals, attaching monitors, their movements precise as they noted her dehydration and malnourishment. Her body frail but stable. Rusty stayed close, his eyes tracking every move, his presence a quiet reassurance. As the paramedics stabilized her, Ellen stood beside David, her hand finding his, her warmth a reminder of their shared strength, while Lily watched from the sidelines, her curiosity now tempered by the gravity of the moment. A police officer arrived shortly after, a young woman with a notepad who introduced herself as Officer Torres, her expression puzzled as she took in the scene. "No ID on her," David explained as the paramedics prepared to move the woman to a stretcher. "She was in the attic. Our dog found her." Officer Torres glanced at Rusty, who was now sitting upright, his ears perked as if listening to the conversation. "Could be she was seeking shelter," she said. "Jotting notes, probably got disoriented and ended up stuck." She didn't seem convinced, her brow furrowing as she looked at the woman now being lifted onto the stretcher, her quilt still wrapped around her like a cocoon. The woman stirred again, her hand reaching weakly toward Rusty, who leaned forward to meet it, his nose brushing her fingers in a gesture that felt almost sacred. "Good dog," she whispered again, her voice clearer now, and the paramedics paused, giving her a moment as Rusty's tail wagged softly. David felt a lump in his throat, the connection between the woman and the dog undeniable, a bond forged in a moment of desperation they could only guess at. The stretcher rolled out, the paramedics calling for clearance as Officer Torres followed, promising to update them at the hospital. Ellen closed the door behind them, the house falling silent except for Rusty's soft huff as he lay back down, his eyes still on the spot where the woman had been. Lily sank onto the couch, her hands shaking. "Slightly, that was intense," she said, her voice breaking the quiet. David nodded, his practical mind struggling to process the morning's events, his eyes meeting Ellen's, where the same questions lingered. Who was she? What had Rusty sensed? Rusty rose, stretching his golden frame before padding to the attic door, again his nose sniffing the air as if checking for something left behind. Ellen touched David's arm, her voice soft. "We did the right thing," she said, "but it's not over, is it?" David shook his head, feeling the weight of Rusty's gaze, the dog's certainty, a call they couldn't ignore. Lily looked at Rusty, her fear giving way to awe. He knew she was there. She said he saved her. The family stood together, their home now, a place of miracles and mysteries. Their bond deepened by the life they'd pulled from the shadows, all because of a dog who refused to look away. The Brookhaven house settled into an uneasy quiet after the paramedics left the living room, still bathed in morning light, but feeling emptier somehow, as if the woman's presence had left an echo behind. David stood by the couch where she'd lay in, his practical mind churning over the morning's events, his hands still tingling from the weight of carrying her down the attic stairs. Rusty curled up near the hearth, his golden fur catching the sunlight, his eyes half closed but alert as if guarding the memory of the woman he'd found. Ellen moved to the kitchen, her baker's hands restless as she began cleaning the counter, her usual calm disrupted by the image of the frail stranger wrapped in her quilt. Lily sat cross-legged on the floor beside Rusty, her college hoodie bunched around her wrists, her fingers absently stroking his fur, her voice soft as she murmured, "He's a hero, isn't he?" The words hung in the air, unanswered, but true. Rusty's instincts having transformed their ordinary morning into something extraordinary. David's thoughts kept circling back to the woman's raspy whisper, "Good dog," her gratitude a thread tying her to Rusty in a way he couldn't shake. He glanced at Ellen, who was scrubbing a spotless counter, her hazel eyes distant, and he knew she felt it too, a pull to understand who this woman was, why she'd been in their attic, how Rusty had known. By midday, David made a decision, his practical side giving way to something deeper, a need to see this through. "I'm going to the hospital," he said, pulling on his jacket, his voice steady but laced with purpose. Ellen paused, her hand still on a dish towel. "Want me to come?" she asked. But David shook his head. "Stay with Lily. Keep things normal here." Lily looked up from Rusty, her curiosity sparking. "Can I go with you, Dad?" she asked. But Ellen's gentle hand on her shoulder settled it. "Not yet. Let's give her time." Rusty lifted his head at the word hospital, his ears perking as if he understood, and David felt a pang knowing the dog would want to be there too. At the hospital, the sterile halls buzzed. With quiet efficiency, nurses moving with purpose as David approached the front desk, his work boots scuffing the polished floor. A nurse with kind eyes led him to a room, where the woman lay, her face cleaner now, but still pale under the fluorescent lights, an IV dripping steadily at her side. "She's stable," the nurse said softly, "but she's got no memory, just confusion. No. Name, no family, we're calling her Jane Doe for now." David nodded, his throat tight, as he stepped closer, the woman's eyes fluttering open at the sound of his footsteps. She looked at him, her gaze cloudy but sharpening as recognition flickered. "You're with the dog," she whispered, her voice stronger now, though still fragile. David smiled. "Not today, but I can bring him," he said, settling into a chair beside her, unsure why he felt so compelled to stay. The woman's lips curved faintly. "Rusty," she said, testing the name like a memory, and David's heart skipped, confirming she'd heard him call the dog's name in the attic. "Do you remember anything?" he asked gently. "How you ended up there?" She frowned, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket. "Not really, just cold and dark, and then his bark, it made me feel safe." Her words landed like stones in David's chest, the idea that Rusty's voice had reached her through despair, binding them in a way he couldn't explain. He sat with her for an hour, her words coming in fits and starts, no clear answers, but a warmth growing between them built on shared gratitude for a dog who'd refused to ignore her. The nurse returned, suggesting rest, but the woman, now calling herself Nora after a name she thought felt right, reached for David's hand. "Bring him," she said, her eyes pleading. David promised he would, his heart lifting at the thought of Rusty's soft fur and steady gaze bringing her comfort. Back home, Ellen and Lily were waiting in the kitchen, the scent of fresh bread filling the air, a sign Ellen had found solace in baking. David recounted the visit, Nora's confusion, her gratitude, Rusty's name on her lips, and Lily's eyes lit up. "Can we take him tomorrow?" she asked, already imagining the reunion. Ellen nodded, her practical streak softening. "He's part of this now." "Isn't he?" she said, glancing at Rusty, who was now sprawled by the hearth, his tail thumping once as if in agreement. The next morning they brought Rusty to the hospital, his leash loose in Lily's hand, his golden frame drawing smiles from nurses as he trotted through the halls. In Nora's room, the change was immediate, her face brightening as Rusty bounded to her side, his nose nudging her hand, his tail wagging like a metronome. Nora sat up straighter, her hands trembling as she stroked his ears. "Good boy." She whispered, tears welling in her eyes, and Rusty leaned into her, his warmth a balm to her fragility. David, Ellen, and Lily watched from the doorway, their hearts swelling. At the sight, a family drawn closer by a dog's unwavering instinct. Nora looked at them, her voice soft. "He saved me, you all did, and David felt the weight of her words, not just gratitude, but a connection that transcended the mystery of her past. Rusty settled beside her bed, his head resting on her lap, his eyes calm but vigilant, and the family knew this was more than a rescue. It was a beginning, a bond forged in trust and instinct that would reshape their lives. As they left the hospital, Lily's hand on Rusty's leash, Ellen's arm linked with David's, they felt the warmth of their shared purpose, their home now a place where miracles began, all because of a dog who heard what no one else could. The Brookhaven house hummed with a new rhythm in the days following Nora's rescue, the morning light softer now, as if the world itself was catching its breath after the whirlwind of the attic discovery. David moved through his routine with a quiet focus, his practical hands tinkering with a leaky faucet in the kitchen, while his mind lingered on Nora, her frail form in the hospital bed, her whispered gratitude to Rusty echoing like a song he couldn't shake. Ellen was in the backyard, her baker's hands buried in the soil of her garden, pulling weeds and planting marigolds, her way of grounding herself after the chaos, her apron swapped for a sun hat that shaded her thoughtful eyes. Lily sprawled on the living room floor, her textbooks open, but ignored her fingers tracing patterns in Rusty's golden fur as he lay beside her, his steady breathing a comfort as she processed the strangeness of their new reality. Rusty seemed calmer now, his vigilant watch over the attic door, replaced by a gentle attentiveness, his warm brown eyes following the family's movements as if he knew his work wasn't done. The hospital visits had become a daily ritual, David and Lily taking Rusty to see Nora, whose strength grew with each encounter, her smile brighter when the dog curled up at her side, his presence coaxing fragments of memory from the fog of her mind. It was on one such afternoon in Ellen's garden that the next piece of the puzzle emerged, unexpected and small but heavy with meaning. Nora, now strong enough to leave the hospital for short outings, had joined Ellen in the backyard, her hands unsteady but eager as she helped plant seedlings, her faded sweater sleeves rolled up to reveal thin wrists still marked by the attic's grime. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs, the garden, a patchwork of color that seemed to soothe Nora's restless spirit. Ellen handed her a trowel, guiding her to a patch of soil near the rose bushes, her voice warm as she chatted about the flowers, her way of easing Nora into the family's world. As Nora dug, her trowel hit something hard, a faint clink breaking the rhythm of their work. She paused, her brow furrowing, as she brushed away the dirt, revealing a tarnished metal key, its surface etched with faint scratches, its loop bent as if it had been carried for years. Ellen leaned closer, her sun hat tipping back. "What's that?" she asked, her practical streak giving way to curiosity, as Nora lifted the key, her fingers trembling, not with weakness, but with a spark of recognition. "It feels familiar," Nora said, her voice soft but certain, like I've held it before. Rusty, who had been dozing in the shade nearby, lifted his head, his ears perking as he trotted over his nose, sniffing the key with an intensity that made Ellen's pulse quicken. David was called from the house, his tools forgotten, as he joined them in the garden, his eyes narrowing at the key in Nora's hand. Lily followed her textbook, abandoned her curiosity, pulling her to the scene like a magnet. Rusty nudged Nora's hand, his whine low and insistent, his tail stiff as if the key were a message he'd been waiting to deliver. David took the key, turning it over in his calloused fingers, its weight heavier than its size suggested. "Maybe it's from the house," he said, thinking of the attic's locked trunks, but the key's shape didn't match any lock he knew. Nora's eyes clouded, her memory still a patchwork of gaps, but she clutched the key tightly. "I think it's mine," she said, "or it was important to someone I knew." The family stood in the garden, the marigolds swaying in the breeze, Rusty's gaze fixed on the key as if it held secrets he could sense but not speak. Ellen suggested they check the attic again. Maybe the key fit something they'd overlooked, but Rusty's sudden bark, sharp and commanding, shifted their focus. He padded to the garden shed, a rickety structure David had been meaning to repair, its door warped from years of rain. Rusty pawed at the base, sniffing the ground, his body taut with purpose. David followed, prying open the door to reveal a clutter of tools and old boxes, the air inside thick with dust and mildew. Rusty pushed past him, his nose leading him to a corner where a pile of tarps hid a small wooden chest, its lock rusted but intact. David's heart thudded as he dragged the chest into the light, the key in his hand suddenly feeling like a bridge to Nora's past. The key fit the lock with a faint click, the mechanism grinding as it turned the chest opening to reveal a bundle of yellowed letters, a faded photograph and a dog tag etched with a name none of them recognized. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the contents, her eyes welling with tears. "I know this," she whispered, though she couldn't say how. Rusty sat beside her, his head resting against her knee, his presence a steady reassurance. As the family gathered around the chest, their questions multiplying, the photograph showed a younger Nora, standing beside a man with a kind smile, a golden retriever at their feet, its resemblance to Rusty uncanny. The letters were unsigned, but spoke of promises, and hiding something safe, hinting at a life interrupted. David met Ellen's eyes, seeing his own resolve mirrored there. This was no coincidence. Rusty had led them to Nora, and now to this, a clue that tied her to a mystery they were only beginning to unravel. Lily reached for the dog tag, her voice hushed. "What does this mean, Dad?" And David shook his head, feeling the weight of Rusty's gaze. The dog's certainty a call to keep searching. The garden, once a place of simple solace, now felt like a map unfolding, each discovery pulling them deeper into Nora's story, a story Rusty seemed to understand better than any of them. Ellen touched Nora's shoulder, her voice warm. "We'll figure it out together." And Nora nodded, her grip on the key tightening as Rusty's tail thumped softly, sealing their shared commitment to the path ahead. The Brookhaven house glowed with the soft light of late afternoon, the living room a haven of warmth as the scent of Ellen's fresh-baked bread mingled with the earthy tang of the garden soil still clinging to their hands. David sat at the kitchen table, the wooden chest from the shed open before him, its contents spread carefully across a clean dish towel, the tarnished key, the yellowed letters, the faded photograph, and the dog tag, each item a fragment of a puzzle that seemed to pulse with Nora's past. Ellen stood beside him, her baker's hands still her hazel eyes, scanning the letters, their cryptic words hinting at secrets kept and promises made. Nora sat across from them, her frail frame wrapped in one of Ellen's soft cardigans, her fingers tracing the edges of the photograph, her face a mix of wonder and confusion as she studied the younger version of herself, standing beside a man whose smile felt like a half-remembered dream. Lily perched on the arm of the couch, her college hoodie swapped for a sweater, her curiosity burning bright as she leaned forward to read the dog tag's inscription, Samuel Reed, a name that meant nothing to her but carried weight in the room's quiet. Rusty lay at Nora's feet, his golden fur a steady presence, his warm brown eyes flicking between the family and the chest, as if guarding the truth they were inching toward. The discovery in the garden had shifted something in the house, a sense that Rusty's instincts were leading them, not just to Nora, but to a story buried deep, one they were now part of, whether they chose it or not. David's practical mind wrestled with the letters, their unsigned lines speaking of hiding something safe, of a dog that would know but offering no clear answers. Ellen suggested calling the police. Maybe they could trace the dog tag, but Nora's soft voice cut through. "I don't think it's that simple," she said, her eyes still on the photograph. "This feels personal." Before they could decide, a knock at the door startled them, Rusty's ears perking as he rose with a low huff, his tail stiff but not wagging. David opened the door to find a woman in a grey blazer, her badge glinting in the fading light. "Officer Sarah Klein," she introduced herself. Her voice polite but firm. "I heard about the woman you found in your attic. Mind if I ask a few questions?" Ellen welcomed her in her warmth, easing the tension as she offered coffee, while Lily scooped up the chest's contents, tucking them back inside with a protective glance at Nora. Officer Klein sat at the table, her notepad open, her eyes sharp as she studied Nora, who met her gaze with a quiet strength that hadn't been there days ago. "We've had a missing persons case open for 3 years, Klein said. Flipping through her notes, Eleanor Tate, a widow from Millwood, about 20 miles. East, similar age, similar build, disappeared after her husband passed, no trace until now. Nora's hand tightened on the photograph, her breath catching Eleanor. She whispered, testing the name like a key turning in a rusty lock. David's heart thudded, the name fitting the woman before them in a way Jane Doe never had. Klein showed a photo from the case file, a slightly younger Nora, her hair neater, her smile brighter standing in a garden not unlike. Ellen's and Nora nodded slowly. "That's me," I think, her voice trembling with the weight of recognition. Ellen reached for her hand, her touch grounding as she murmured, "You're home now." Klein explained that Eleanor Tate had vanished without. A note her car found abandoned near a wooded trail. No signs of foul play, just a sudden absence that baffled her small community. Her daughter Claire was living in Richmond now they'd lost touch after a family rift. But Klein had already contacted her, and she was on her way. Nora's eyes welled, her fingers clutching the dog tag. "Samuel was my husband," she said, the memory. Breaking through like sunlight through clouds he loved. Dogs trained them to help people. The pieces clicked for David. The dog tag, the photograph, the golden retriever that looked so much like Rusty, it was no coincidence. Rusty nudged Nora's knee, his whine soft but insistent, as if confirming her words, his presence tying the past to the present. Lily's eyes widened. "Dad, this is huge," she said, her voice hushed with awe as she looked at Rusty, who seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Klein took notes, her expression softening as she watched Nora. "Sometimes grief makes people wander," she said gently. "We'll need to verify everything, but it looks like you've found her family." David felt a surge of pride, not just in Rusty, but in their willingness to follow his lead to open their home to a stranger who was no longer a stranger. Ellen offered Klein more coffee, her practical streak returning as she asked about next steps. But Nora's voice cut through again. Claire's coming. She said, her tone a mix of hope and fear. Her daughter, who she hadn't seen in years now, a bridge to a life she was only beginning to reclaim. Rusty rose, stretching his golden frame before settling at Nora's side, his head resting on her lap, his eyes calm but vigilant, as if he knew his work was far from over. The family sat together as Klein left, promising to return with Claire, the air thick with anticipation and a warmth that came from shared purpose. David looked at Ellen, seeing his own resolve mirrored in her eyes, their home now a sanctuary for Nora's healing, a place where Rusty's instincts had sparked a miracle. Lily reached for the photograph, her fingers tracing the golden retriever's outline. "He was like Rusty, wasn't he?" she said, and Nora nodded, her smile faint but real. "Samuel always said the dogs knew what we couldn't." The dog tag gleamed on the foil table, a silent promise that more answers waited, a mystery that Rusty had only begun to unravel. Ellen touched Nora's shoulder, her voice warm. "We'll meet Claire together." And Nora's nod was a vow to face whatever came next with the family who'd saved her. Rusty's tail thumped softly, sealing their bond, a family drawn closer by a dog who saw what no one else could, a dog who was leading them deeper into a story they were only beginning to understand. The Brookhaven house brimmed with nervous energy. The following morning, the living room bathed in soft sunlight that filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor, where Rusty lay sprawled, his golden fur a quiet beacon of calm. David stood by the window, his practical hands fidgeting with the edge of a curtain, his eyes scanning the gravel drive for any sign of Claire's car. His heart a mix of anticipation and hope for Nora, who sat on the couch, her frail frame wrapped in Ellen's softest quilt, her fingers clutching the dog tag etched with Samuel's name. Ellen moved through the kitchen, her baker's hands kneading dough for a fresh batch of rolls, her way of channeling the morning's tension, her hum replaced by a focused silence as she glanced at Nora, offering a reassuring smile. Lily perched on the arm of the couch, her college hoodie swapped for a neat blouse. Her dark curls tamed for the occasion, her curiosity tempered by the weight of the reunion about to unfold. Rusty lifted his head, his warm brown eyes flicking to Nora, his tail giving a slow thump, as if sensing her unease, his steady presence a reminder of the miracle that had brought them here. The past week had woven Nora into their lives, her quiet gratitude, her growing strength during hospital visits, her connection to Rusty, binding her to the family in ways they hadn't expected. Now the sound of tires on gravel broke the quiet, and David's breath caught as a blue sedan pulled into the drive, a woman stepping out, her face a mix of Nora's features and something fiercer, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "Claire," David said softly, turning to Nora, who stood, her hands trembling as she smoothed the quilt, her expression a fragile blend of hope and fear. Ellen emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her warmth ready to bridge any awkwardness. As Lily opened the front door, Rusty trotting to her side, his ears perked but his body calm. Claire stepped onto the porch, her gaze locking onto Nora, and for a moment the world stilled, no words, just a mother and daughter seeing each other after years of silence. "Mum." Claire whispered, her voice breaking as she crossed the threshold, her arms wrapping around Nora in a fierce embrace, tears spilling freely as Nora clung to her, her own sobs muffled against Claire's shoulder. Rusty pressed close, his nose, nudging their legs, his tail wagging softly, as if sealing their reunion with his quiet approval. David felt a lump in his throat, his practical side overwhelmed by the raw emotion unfolding, Ellen's hand finding his, her fingers squeezing gently as they watched from the sidelines. Lily's eyes glistened, her usual chatter replaced by a quiet awe as she knelt beside Rusty, her hand on his fur whispering, "Good boy." Claire pulled back her hands, cupping Nora's face. "You're really here," she said, her voice thick with relief. "And love, I thought I'd lost you forever." Nora's smile was tentative but real. "I'm here now," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days, thanks to them, to him, nodding at Rusty, who sat proudly, his golden frame a bridge between past and present. The family moved to the living room, Claire sitting close to Nora, their hands clasped as they spoke in low tones, catching up on years apart, the rift that had grown after Samuel's death, now softening under the weight of their reunion. Ellen brought out coffee and rolls, her warmth filling the room as she listened, her heart swelling at the sight of Nora's joy. David joined them, his practical questions about Nora's future, tempered by the moment's tenderness, while Lily hovered nearby, her curiosity sparking at Claire's stories of Nora's love for gardening, her knack for training dogs with Samuel. As the afternoon waned, Claire explained that Nora had nowhere to go, her old home sold after her disappearance, the shelters in Millwood full, her savings depleted. Ellen didn't hesitate, her voice firm. "We've got the guest room," she said, looking at David, who nodded without a second thought. "It's yours, Nora, as long as you need." Nora's eyes welled, her gratitude spilling over. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her hand resting on Rusty's head, who leaned into her, his warmth a constant reassurance. Claire smiled, her relief palpable. "I'll visit every weekend," she promised, "but knowing Mum's here with you, it's more than I could have hoped." The decision felt right, a natural extension of the bond Rusty had forged the family's home, now a sanctuary for Nora's healing. In the days that followed, Nora settled into the guest room, her strength returning as she helped Ellen in the kitchen, her hands steadier as she chopped vegetables or kneaded dough, her quiet humor emerging in small moments that warmed the house. Lily took to her like a grandmother, borrowing Nora's stories of old Brookhaven for a history project, her laughter filling the evenings as Nora recounted Samuel's antics with their dogs. Rusty was never far, his golden presence a constant at Nora's side, his tail wagging as she scratched his ears, his vigilance softening into companionship. David watched it all, his practical heart expanding with pride, not just in Rusty, but in their willingness to open their lives to someone who'd been a stranger only days ago. One evening, as they sat on the porch, the sky streaked with pink, Nora spoke softly. "You gave me a home," she said, her eyes on Rusty, who sprawled at her feet, "but he gave me a reason to keep going." Ellen reached for her hand, her voice warm. "Your family now, simple as that." Lily grinned from the porch swing. "He's still a hero, isn't he?" And David nodded, feeling the truth of it. Rusty's instincts had sparked a chain of miracles, each one drawing them closer together. The dog tag rested on the mantel now beside a photo of Nora and Claire, a silent reminder of the past they were piecing together. Rusty's ears twitched as a distant owl hooted, his eyes calm but alert, as if he knew the story wasn't over, that the key, the letters, the dog tag were threads in a larger tapestry he was still weaving. David met Ellen's eyes, seeing the same. Certainty there, their home. A place where love and mystery intertwined, all because of a dog who refused to let go. The Brookhaven house settled into a gentle rhythm as spring deepened the morning light, filtering through the lace curtains to dance across the living room, where Nora now sat each day, her frail hands steadier as she folded laundry or helped Ellen. Sort recipes, her presence a quiet thread woven into the family's life. David moved through his chores with a renewed sense of purpose, his practical hands fixing a creaky porch step, while his mind lingered on the wooden chest from the garden shed its contents, the tarnished key, the yellowed letters, the faded photograph, and the dog tag etched with Samuel Reed's name still spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a map they hadn't yet charted. Ellen hummed softly in the kitchen, her baker's hands shaping dough for a neighbor's order, her warmth anchoring the house even as her thoughts drifted to the mystery Rusty had uncovered. Lily sprawled on the couch, her textbooks open, but untouched, her fingers twirling a pencil as she stole glances at Rusty, who lay by the hearth, his golden fur catching the light, his warm brown eyes calm but watchful, as if he knew the chest held secrets he'd yet to reveal. The family had grown accustomed to Nora's stories, her memories of Samuel's love for training dogs trickling out during quiet moments, each one painting a picture of a man whose life had been entwined with golden retrievers, much like Rusty. But it was Rusty himself who broke the morning's calm. His sudden rise from the hearth, his ears perked, as he padded to the staircase leading to the attic door, his nose sniffing the air with a focus that made David's heart skip. The dog's low whine drew Ellen from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour as she followed his gaze. "What's he after now?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and caution. Lily sat up, her pencil dropping. "He's doing it again," she said, her eyes bright with the thrill of another discovery. Nora stood slowly, her cardigan slipping off one shoulder, her expression a blend of hope and unease as she joined them. "Rusty's right," she said softly. "There's more up there, I can feel it." David set down his hammer, his practical side giving way. "To the pull of Rusty's instincts, let's check," he said, leading the way to the attic stairs. Rusty bounding ahead, his tail stiff, but wagging once as if urging them to hurry. The attic was as they'd left it, dusty and cluttered with boxes and old furniture. But Rusty didn't hesitate, weaving through the maze to a corner near the eaves, where a loose floorboard jutted slightly askew. He pawed at it, his whine sharp, and commanding his golden frame taut with purpose. David knelt, prying the board free with a screwdriver, the wood groaning as it gave way to reveal a small tin box, its surface rusted but intact. Ellen's breath caught as he lifted it out, the weight heavier than expected, while Lily leaned closer. Her curiosity sparking, "Is it locked?" she asked, but the lid opened easily, revealing a single folded letter and another dog tag, this one etched. With a different name, James Carter. Nora's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling. Samuel knew him, she whispered, her voice trembling with memory. He was a friend, helped with the dogs. The letter was written in a neat, steady hand, its words cryptic but urgent. "If you find this, the dogs have led you, keep it safe. The promise lives on," signed, simply, S.R. David's pulse quickened, the initials matching Samuel Reed, the promise hinting at something larger than one man's life. Ellen read the letter aloud, her voice steady but soft. "It's like a message meant for us," she said, glancing at Rusty, who sat proudly, his nose nudging the tin as if to say, "Keep going." Lily picked up the dog tag, her fingers tracing the name James Carter. "Dad, this isn't just about Nora, is it?" she said, her voice hushed with awe. David shook his head, his practical mind struggling to grasp the scope of what Rusty had uncovered. A legacy of dogs trained to find those in need, a network tied to Samuel, and perhaps others, like James Carter. Nora's eyes cleared with sudden clarity. Samuel always said the dogs were guardians. She said he trained them to sense trouble, to find people who were lost, not just in body, but in spirit. Rusty's tail thumped softly, his gaze steady as if confirming her words, his role in their lives, now more than instinct, but part of a deliberate design. The family returned to the living room, the tin box joining the chest's contents on the table, each item a clue to a hidden world they were only beginning to understand. Ellen suggested contacting Officer Klein. Maybe she could trace James Carter, but David hesitated. "This feels bigger than the police," he said, his eyes on Rusty, who had resumed his watch by the hearth. Lily pulled out her laptop, already searching for James Carter, her fingers flying across the keys. "He could be anywhere," she said. "But if Samuel knew him, there's a trail." Nora nodded, her hands folding the letter carefully. "I want to help," she said, her voice stronger now. "You've given me a home, I owe you this." Ellen touched her shoulder, her warmth a quiet vow, "We're in this together," and David felt the truth of it, their family no longer just a unit, but keepers of a mystery Rusty had brought to light. The photograph of Nora and Samuel with their golden retriever sat on the mantel. Now a reminder of the past, they were unraveling the dog tags glinting beside it, like stars in a constellation only Rusty could read. As evening fell, the house glowed. With purpose, the family gathered around the table, their voices overlapping as they debated next steps. Rusty's presence a steady heartbeat in the room. Lily's search yielded a faint lead, a James Carter linked to a dog training program in a nearby town decades ago, and David felt a spark of hope. This could be it, he said. But it was Rusty's soft huff, his eyes fixed on the attic stairs that sealed their resolve. The dog knew more was out there waiting, a legacy of guardianship that stretched beyond their home, beyond Nora's past, a promise they were now part of, all because of a dog who refused to let the truth stay buried. The Brookhaven house buzzed with a quiet determination as the morning sun spilled through the windows, casting golden streaks across the kitchen table, where the tin box and wooden chest sat, their contents now organized into neat piles. The letters, dog tags, and photograph a roadmap to a past that felt alive with purpose. David stood by the counter, his practical hands stirring a mug of coffee, his eyes tracing the handwritten letter signed by Samuel Reed, its words about a promise and dogs that led echoing in his mind like a call to action. Ellen was in the living room, her baker's hands folding a quilt for Nora, who sat nearby, her frail frame steadier, now her fingers clutching a pencil as she jotted down fragments of memory sparked by the name James Carter. Lily hunched over her laptop at the table, her dark curls falling into her eyes as she scrolled through old records, her college assignments forgotten in favor of chasing the faint lead they'd found, a James Carter tied to a dog training program in Millwood, 20 miles east, decades ago. Rusty lay sprawled by the hearth, his golden fur a beacon of calm, his warm brown eyes flicking to the family as if sensing the weight of their task, his tail thumping softly when Nora spoke his name. The discovery of the tin box had shifted the house's rhythm. Nora's presence no longer just a miracle, but a key to a legacy of guardianship. Rusty had uncovered a legacy tied to Samuel and James, and dogs like the one in the photograph, so, like Rusty, it seemed no coincidence. Lily's voice broke the quiet, found something, she said, her screen glowing with a scanned newspaper clipping from 1985, a grainy photo of a man with a golden retriever at a Millwood fair, the caption naming him James Carter, a local trainer known for rescue dogs. Nora leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "That's him," she said, her voice firm with sudden clarity. "He helped Samuel with the dogs, they were friends." David set down his mug, his practical mind racing. "This is our trail," he said, looking at Ellen, who nodded, her baker's warmth giving way to resolve. "Let's go find it." The family decided to visit Millwood, Nora insisting she come along, her strength bolstered by Rusty's steady presence, her need to understand her past outweighing her fragility. Rusty bounded to the car, his leash loose in Lily's hand, his golden frame vibrating with purpose, as if he knew the journey was his to lead. The drive to Millwood was quiet, the rolling hills of Virginia blooming with spring's first greens, the air fresh with the promise of answers. Millwood was smaller than Brookhaven, its main street lined with brick storefronts and a library that doubled as a historical archive where Lily's research had pointed them. The librarian, a kind woman with silver hair, led them to a back room stacked with boxes of local records, her eyes lighting up when she saw Rusty, who trotted politely at Nora's side. "You're here about Carter," she said, pulling a file labeled Community Events 1980s, her fingers deft as she handed them a folder of clippings and notes. David opened it, his heart thudding as he found more photos of James Carter, always with a golden retriever. His smile warm but guarded the articles praising his dogs for finding lost hikers or alerting families to danger. Nora's hand trembled. As she touched a photo, Samuel trusted him. She said he said James knew how to teach the dogs to listen. Ellen's brow furrowed. Listen to what she asked, but Nora shook her head, the memory still out of reach. Rusty, who had been sniffing the room's corners, suddenly barked sharp and clear, his nose, pointing to a box on a lower shelf labeled Donations 1986. Lily knelt, pulling it open to reveal a jumble of papers and a small leather journal, its cover. Worn but intact, the first page inscribed Property of James Carter. David's pulse quickened as he opened it, the pages filled with notes on dog training temperament tests and cryptic references to safe places and those who need finding. One entry stood out, dated 1987. "Samuel's gone, but the work continues. The dogs will lead them to the barn." Nora gasped, her eyes welling. "That's our barn," she said, "the one behind our old house in Millwood." The family exchanged glances, the trail. And now clear Rusty's instincts, guiding them to a place tied to Nora's past, a place where answers waited. They thanked the librarian, piling into the car with the journal, Rusty's tail wagging, as they drove to the outskirts of Millwood, where Nora's old property lay, a modest plot, now overgrown but marked by a weathered barn, its red paint peeling under years of neglect. Rusty leapt out his nose to the ground, weaving through tall grass until he stopped at the barn's sagging door, his bark commanding as he pawed the earth. David pushed the door open, the air inside thick with dust and the scent of old hay, as saw shadows hiding a stack of crates in the corner. Rusty darted to one, his whine urgent, as Ellen helped David pry it open, revealing a metal box sealed with a lock, the tarnished key from the garden, a perfect fit. Inside were more letters, a map of local trails and a faded photograph of 3 golden retrievers, their names scrawled on the back, Guardian, Keeper, Sentinel. Each one a mirror of Rusty's steady gaze. Nora sank to her knees, her voice soft. "Samuel and James, they built this for people like me, people who were lost." Lily's eyes shone. "This is huge," she said, clutching the map. "It's like a network." David nodded, his practical heart swelling with the scope of what Rusty had led them to, a legacy of dogs trained to find those in need, a mission that had saved. Nora and now called them to act. Ellen touched Nora's shoulder, her voice warm. "We'll keep looking together," and Rusty's tail thumped, sealing their vow. The barn felt alive with possibility, its shadows no longer empty, but filled with the echoes of Samuel's work, James's dedication, and Rusty's unerring instinct. As they drove home, the journal and box in the back seat, David glanced at Rusty, who stared out the window, his golden fur catching the fading light, his eyes calm but vigilant. The map hinted at other safe places, other dogs, other lives waiting to be found, a trail they were now bound to follow, all because of a dog who knew what no one else could. The Brookhaven house glowed with a renewed sense of mission as the morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting warm patterns across the living room where the family gathered around the kitchen table, now a command center for the legacy Rusty had uncovered. David sat with the metal box from the Millwood barn open before him, his practical hands sorting through the letters, map, and photograph of the 3 golden retrievers. Their names, Guardian, Keeper, Sentinel, scrawled on the back, each one a testament to Samuel and James Carter's work. Ellen stood at the counter, her baker's hands shaping dough for a community potluck, her warmth anchoring the house, even as her mind churned with the scope of their discovery, a network of dogs trained to find those in need. Nora perched on a stool, her frail frame stronger now, her eyes bright as she read aloud from James's journal, her voice steady with purpose as she shared notes about dogs sensing distress before it struck. Lily typed furiously on her laptop, her dark curls tucked behind her ears, her college studies sidelined by the urge to cross-reference the map's trails with local history, her curiosity a spark that kept the family moving forward. Rusty lay sprawled by the hearth, his golden fur a quiet beacon, his warm brown eyes tracking their movements, his tail thumping softly when Nora mentioned the dogs' names, as if he recognized his place in their lineage. The barn's contents had transformed the family's perspective, their home no longer just a sanctuary for Nora, but a hub for a mission that stretched beyond Brookhaven, a calling Rusty had ignited with his relentless instincts. David's practical mind wrestled with the map's cryptic markings, trails leading to wooded areas and old farms, but no clear purpose, yet his heart stirred by the idea that they were part of something bigger. Ellen suggested sharing the findings with Officer Klein, but a phone call that afternoon changed their plans. The caller introduced himself as Michael Grant, a researcher from a nearby university, his voice calm but eager. "I read about your dog finding a woman in your attic," he said. "I've been studying unusual canine behavior for years, and your Rusty fits a pattern." David invited him over his curiosity, piqued by the idea that Rusty's actions weren't isolated. Michael arrived by noon, a lanky man in his 50s, with a worn satchel and a gentle smile that put Nora at ease. Rusty greeted him with a sniff and a wag. His golden frame relaxed but alert, as Michael sat at the table, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the journal and dog tags. "You've stumbled onto something extraordinary," he said, spreading out his own notes articles about golden retrievers across Virginia who'd saved lives, found missing hikers, alerted families to fires, all trained by a man named Samuel Reed and his partner, James Carter. Nora's breath caught. "That's my Samuel," she said, her hand clutching the dog tag. Her memories sharper now as she recalled his late-night training sessions with dogs like Guardian. Michael nodded, his research tracing a loose network of trainers who'd worked with Samuel in the 1980s, passing on dogs to families in need, a quiet legacy of guardianship that had faded after Samuel's death and James's disappearance. "Rusty's one of them," Michael said, his eyes on the dog who sat proudly by Nora's side, bred to sense distress to find those who are lost. Lily's fingers paused on her keyboard. "This is like a secret society of dogs," she said, her voice a mix of awe and excitement. David leaned forward, his practical side giving way to resolve. "What do we do with this?" he asked, and Michael's answer was simple. "Keep it alive, document the stories, follow the map, help where you can." The family agreed, their home now a keeper of Samuel's work, Rusty's instincts their guide. That evening, as the potluck buzzed with neighbors, Rusty's heroics the talk of the town, a new opportunity arose. A neighbor mentioned a child missing from a nearby park, last seen near a trail marked on their map, and David felt a surge of purpose. "Let's go," he said, Rusty already at the door, his leash in Lily's hand. The family piled into the car, Nora included, her strength bolstered by the chance to honor Samuel's legacy. At the park, Rusty took the lead, his nose to the ground, weaving through pines until he stopped at a thicket, his bark sharp and clear. David pushed through the branches, finding a small boy curled up, shivering, but unharmed, his eyes wide, as Rusty nudged him gently. The reunion with his parents was tearful, the family's role quiet but profound. Rusty's golden fur a beacon in the dusk as they led the boy to safety. Back home, the family gathered around the table, Michael still there, his satchel now filled with their notes. "This is just the beginning," he said. "You're continuing what Samuel started." Ellen touched Nora's hand, her voice warm. "We're doing this for him, for all of them," and Nora nodded, her eyes on Rusty, who sprawled by the hearth, his tail thumping softly. Lily added the boy's rescue to a growing file, her laptop a digital archive of Rusty's work, while David studied the map, its trails now alive with possibility. The photograph of Guardian, Keeper, and Sentinel sat on the mantel beside Samuel's dog tag, a reminder of the dogs who'd come before each one, a link in a chain Rusty was forging anew. Nora spoke softly. "Samuel would be proud," she said, and David felt the truth of it. Their family transformed by a dog who saw what no one else could, a dog who'd given them a purpose to carry forward. Rusty's eyes met David's, calm but vigilant, as if he knew more. Waited out there, more lives to find, more trails to follow. The house hummed with quiet resolve, the potluck's laughter fading into the night, their mission clear: to listen to Rusty, to keep the legacy alive, all because of a golden retriever who refused to let the lost stay hidden. The Brookhaven house stood bathed in the golden light of a late spring morning, the lace curtains swaying gently as a breeze carried the scent of blooming lilacs through the open windows. The living room, a quiet testament to the journey that had unfolded within its walls. David sat on the porch, his practical hands resting on a mug of coffee, his eyes soft as he watched Rusty sprawl across the grass, his golden fur flecked with gray, now his movements slower, but his warm brown eyes still bright with the instinct that had changed their lives. Ellen was in the kitchen, her baker's hands shaping pastries for a town fair, her hum mingling with Nora's soft laughter as they swapped stories of Samuel's quirks, their bond a steady heartbeat in the house. Nora, now a fixture in their home, moved with newfound ease, her frail frame filled out by months of care, her hands steady as she sorted seeds for Ellen's garden, her memories of Samuel and their dogs no longer fragments but a tapestry she wove into every day. Lily lounged on the porch swing, her laptop open to a blog she'd started chronicling Rusty's rescues. her college dreams now tied to preserving the legacy of Samuel's guardian dogs, her dark curls bouncing as she typed with purpose. The family had grown into their role as keepers of a hidden network, Rusty's instincts leading them to 3 more rescues, since the boy in the park, each one a thread in the web of Samuel and James Carter's work, now documented in a growing archive that Michael Grant, their researcher friend, called a living history. The mantle held the photograph of guardian keeper and sentinel beside Samuel's dog tag, and the tarnished key a shrine to the dogs who'd come before and the promise they'd carried. But time had left its mark on Rusty, his once boundless energy. Tempered by age, his golden frame stiffer, after long walks though his spirit remained unyielding, his nose still sniffing the air for traces of those in need. David felt a pang watching him, knowing their hero's days were numbered. His practical heart wrestling with the ache of love for a dog who'd reshaped their world. As the morning unfolded, a soft bark broke the quiet, not Rusty's deep woof, but a higher, sharper sound that drew David's gaze to the gravel drive. A young golden retriever pup, barely 6 months old, bounded toward the house, her fur a bright gold, her paws too big for her lanky frame, her tail a blur of excitement. A woman followed her face, unfamiliar, but kind, her eyes crinkling as she approached. "I'm sorry," she said, "my dog just bolted from the car like she knew to come here." Rusty rose slowly, his tail wagging, as he sniffed the pup who yipped and rolled onto her back, her playful energy a mirror of Rusty's younger days. Ellen stepped onto the porch, her apron dusted with flour, her warmth easing the stranger's nerves, while Nora and Lily joined them, their eyes wide at the sight of the pup, who now nuzzled Rusty as if recognizing a mentor. The woman explained she'd adopted the pup named Daisy from a shelter in Millwood, the same town where Samuel's barn stood. Her behavior uncanny, always pulling toward certain places, barking at shadows no one else saw. David's heart thudded, the pattern too familiar to ignore, and Michael's words echoed Rusty's, one of them bred to find those who are lost. Lily knelt beside Daisy, her voice soft. "She's like you, Rusty, isn't she?" And Rusty's slow wag seemed to agree, his eyes calm, but knowing as if he'd been waiting for this moment. The woman hesitated. "I don't know why she led me here," she said, "but it feels right. Maybe you're meant to have her." Ellen's hand found David's, her resolve clear. "She's welcome here," she said, and Nora nodded, her smile radiant. Samuel would have loved her. The family invited the woman in, sharing coffee and stories of Rusty's rescues, the woman marveling at the blog Lily showed her. Daisy curled at Rusty's side, the 2 dogs a bridge between past and future. By afternoon, the woman left, Daisy staying behind her leash now in Lily's hand, a new chapter unfolding as Rusty rested on the porch, his graying muzzle serene. That evening the family gathered in the living room, the mantel's relics glowing under the lamplight. Rusty sprawled by the hearth, Daisy tucked against him, her tiny snores a counterpoint to his steady breaths. Lily spoke first, her voice firm. "I'll train her dad like Samuel did. I'll keep it going." David nodded, his practical heart swelling with pride in her commitment in their shared purpose, while Ellen reached for Nora's hand, her warmth a vow, "We'll all help." Nora's eyes glistened. "Samuel's dogs never stopped," she said, "and now we won't either." David looked at Rusty, his hero, his friend who'd found Nora in the attic, who'd led them to a barn, a legacy, a purpose that had made their home a beacon for the lost. Rusty's eyes met his calm but vigilant, a silent promise that Daisy would carry on his work. The family sat together, reflecting on the miracles Rusty had sparked, the lives saved, the bonds forged, all because of a dog who sensed what no one else could. Lily added Daisy's arrival to the blog, her words a tribute to Rusty's legacy, a call for others to listen to their dogs, to follow their instincts. The house felt full alive with love and possibility. The mantel's photograph now joined by a new one of Rusty and Daisy, their golden fur a testament to the torch being passed. As night fell, David stepped onto the porch, Rusty following slowly, Daisy bounding at his heels, the stars bright above Brookhaven. He scratched Rusty's ears, his voice soft, "You did good, boy," and Rusty leaned into him, his tail thumping once ceiling. Their bond. The legacy would live on in Daisy and Lily, in the family who'd answered Rusty's call, a heartwarming story of trust and instinct that would echo long after Rusty's final rest, all because of a golden retriever who refused to let the lost stay hidden.